Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you all had a good lunch and are ready for the next session. I see my ex-boss right in front of me. Hi, Shireen. How are you? Anyway, very quickly, the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us how vulnerable we are as a people, how quickly a microscopic organism can impact the entire world. And this pandemic has exposed a lot of weaknesses in organizations, in global governments, as well as in the global economy. It's impacted every area of our lives, from social to economic to personal, psychological. Here in Malaysia, we've actually done a really great job of containing it, and I think we need to pat ourselves in the back for that. But at the same time, this containment has come at a cost. A recent headline talked about how the Malaysian economy has shrunk by something like 17% thanks to COVID-19. So what do we do next? What kind of impact has this COVID had on us? There has been poor financial results, supply chain disruptions, retrenchment or pay cut for employees, and there's a lot we need to do to recover from this crisis. Today, we have with us a very distinguished panel of guests who will be talking to you about different perspectives on this crisis, on our topic post-COVID-19 and pandemic planning, and what should employees and businesses be doing about that. We'll start with opening remarks from each of our panelists. And I would first like to invite Professor Niaz Asadullah from University Malaya to come and speak his opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Rashmi, and again, thanks to KSI for inviting me. So let me start with a clarifying remark. Pandemic planning is a difficult task because we are facing a range of uncertainties, and our response and choices to these uncertainties involve a range of moral dilemmas. The choices we face before us involve trade-offs. How do we save business from the double shock of demand and supply while also protecting vulnerable employment groups, such as single mothers? How do we cut operation costs whilst also protecting labor standards? How do we balance the need between the society and business? Do we continue to hire migrant workers because it makes good business sense, or do we adopt Malaysian first employment policy? All of these choices, again, involve difficult trade-offs, but the difficulty is amplified by the fact that the consequence of this choices that we would make to deal with these trade-offs are also uncertain. So while we know that there is this great shift towards working from home, remote service delivery, we don't know how this would affect worker performance. We don't know what will be the long-term impact on labor productivity. Whilst we know that working from home offers great work-life balance, which is good news for female workers, we don't know how this would turn employment into precarious contracts. There's this global pandemic long before the crisis in the form of casualization of labor. Is our response in terms of human resource policies going to reinforce that pandemic? Are we going to see more subcontracting of labor? What would that mean for labor standard? What would that mean for precarious nature of employment? And again, when we are talking about reforming the labor market, moving away from an equilibrium where we are dependent on migrant workers to one where we prioritize Malaysian workers, we don't know what will be the response of the native workforce. Who is going to step in when migrant workers leave? 80% of workforce in Malaysia, men participate, 80%, but the big deficit is among women. Are Malaysian women are going to step in to take up jobs left behind by the migrant workers, or will the industry face a serious labor shortage? So these are the range of uncertainties that we have before us. So we know that we have choices to make that involve trade-offs, but at the same time, we have a great deal of uncertainty regarding what those choices would lead to. So therefore, this is where I want to turn to the next part of my opening remarks, that how do we move forward? So we have to accept that we have to continue with trial and error basis. We will have to try different policies on small scale to work out what is the optimal human resource response to the changing work circumstances. At the same time, this crisis brings before us an opportunity to prioritize policies and reforms that have been long overdue. So these are what I call no regret policies. I call them no regret policies because pursuing them comes at no cost to business and society. And I say this because the pandemic has coincided with a tectonic shift in Malaysian social policy. This very year, government has revised the poverty line. There is this society-wide demand now for even upgrading minimum wage up to the new poverty line. Malaysians are talking about living wage. Malaysians are also talking about linking wages to productivity. Malaysian government's Vision Prosperity 2030 document is emphasizing productivity-linked wage system. There is also talk about addressing social dialogue deficit, giving voice to workers, pushing unionization in the labor force, emphasizing bargaining power. These are all very new developments, but the signal is very clear, the message is very clear. Malaysians are saying no to indecent work conditions. The priority should be addressing decent work deficit. And this is what I want to single out as no regret policy. The reason is for a long time, Malaysian labor market has been stuck in a low pay, low productivity equilibrium. And there has been a lot of this blame game that the industry is blaming the government for failing to supply well-trained, future-proof workforce. And the government is blaming the industry for not paying well. So this is what in economics we call a prisoner's dilemma, that everyone is pursuing strategies and options that are individually beneficial, but they are being deprived of the choices that, if coordinated, could leave everyone better off. So there is this big coordination failure for Malaysia for a long time, which has left the country stuck with a labor-dependent, low-pay, poor work condition equilibrium, and that has discouraged investment in the industry, in good work conditions, and that has also distorted the labor supply response that Malaysians with high productivity are leaving the country, not staying behind. So these are the kind of challenges that the government should prioritize in collaboration with business. So we need a responsible business community that would no longer draw the binary between ecology and economy, between business and labor standard. We have to understand that time has come for integrating and aligning the needs of the economy and the society. No longer social protection should be a matter only for the government to address. Business is a responsibility. Pursuing social dialogue at workplace, upholding labor standards, protecting regimes, human resource regime for decent work provision is at the core of the mission of sustainability. And what the pandemic has taught us is that the state-business relation, the relationship between the private sector and the public sector, has to be rediscovered with a focus on sustainability. We cannot do it alone. If business as usual approach continues in the way we hire labor, in the way we use resources, in the way we reward workers, that is not going to be sustainable. We have seen how delicate the boundary is between public health and the economy. We have to have a business approach that takes care of nature, that takes care of labor standards, and at the same time addresses the needs of the economy. And in that context, I also want to bring up again the role of the state, that while we want to hold the business sector responsible, we also want to have a responsive state. A state that would also respect the emerging labor norms, not just in the private sector, but also implement them and adopt them in the state sector, GLCs. So when we are talking about Equitable Employment Act, when we are talking about social dialogue deficit, when we are talking about empowering workers, when we are talking about introducing grievances mechanism, these are all matters that should be addressed by all employers, be that private, be that public, be that GLCs. So therefore, moving forward for business continuity, for pandemic planning, the focus should be again on prioritizing regret policies, no regret policies, which would align the needs of the society and the economy, and it is not something that should be left entirely to the business sector or to the state sector. So we have to therefore internalize compliance as something intrinsically valuable. So compliance should not be something a matter of choice. The business community has to understand that there's an intrinsic value in compliance, so that if the government cannot catch me, I can continue to defy the labor standard. So we have to shift away from that mindset. So on that point, I will stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. I think if you've looked at your list of panelists, you realize that there were 7 people, but only 5 are on stage. 2 of them will be joining us virtually. So our next panelist will be Mr. Prashant Chadha of Korn Ferry. Can we have him on screen, please?
Hello, everybody. I just want to do a quick sound check to make sure you can all hear me. If the panelists can give the thumbs up, awesome. Thank you very much. First off, sorry I can't be there in person. I'm actually just about 15 minutes away from all of you, but I had a little bit of a cold, so I didn't want to take a chance and come there and potentially infect everybody. So thank you for bearing with me. I'm just going to get some slides up, and I'll make sure that I keep to time. If I could request the opportunity to share my screen. At the moment, it's been disabled, so if I could ask the host to share the screen or permit me to share the screen. If not, I can. If you can bring up my slides, I can talk about it really quickly. So maybe while we are waiting for the permission, if you could just let me know if the slides are up, or if you'd like me to hold on to sharing my slides. Apologies, I can't see the screen, so I'm not sure if it's up.
Prashant, you are up. Your screen's
up. Okay, perfect. Perfect. Thank you so much. So maybe if I'm on the cover slide, I can jump straight in. Again, thank you so much for having me for the session. I'm looking forward to spending the next 7 minutes or so with you. First off, many of you may know us as Korn Ferry, but some of you might still know us as what we were formerly called, which is Group. Essentially, we assist boards, executive teams, people champions behind the scenes with things like professional services that span organization strategy, assessing and succession, executive and professional search, leadership development, executive and broad-based total rewards optimization. And we've been involved with multiple such initiatives. So what I'm going to present to you today is a bit of a flavor from many of these initiatives, just to pique your interest enough to start thinking about it and potentially start acting on it. If I could, thank you very much. If I could go to the next slide, essentially there's a lot of information here, but let me try and break it down for all of you. Look, there's no secret. It's talked about a lot. Pandemic has impacted all of us. From a national perspective, from an organization perspective, and all of us within our communities. So when we advise the government and organizations, we focus on 5 archetypes that have emerged out of this pandemic. Archetypes essentially look to characterize the definition of a company's potential, their ambition, and finally the ability that they demonstrate. So the little grid that you see over there, the x-axis or the flat line, is essentially the financial strength. And the why is strategic direction. So what we try to do is look at organizations from both these perspectives before we get into any organization or talent or a consumer kind of decision making. As I speak with you about these different kinds of organizations, what will help is if you think about your own organization, it'll help you contextualize and also think about what you could potentially do when you leave this session today, especially since we have limited admin resources. The first one that you can see at the bottom left of your grid are those that are in survival mode. These are organizations that are in a lot of trouble. The financial impact is immense. They're bleeding money as we speak. But their strategy has also been impacted. These organizations are scrambling to save the organization, to avoid bankruptcy, or even having to sell the organization to manage their current situation. Now, we've all seen them. When we've come out of our MCO, we walk through the malls and we've seen these organizations, unfortunately. Many of them have shut down. The hospitality industry has also been impacted severely. The second is the one on top, above survival. It's good strategy. I mean, they had a good strategy, but unfortunately, because of it could have been investments they've made or because of cash flow, they have been financially impacted. These organizations are in the midst of realigning and carefully managing costs and structure. The intention is to come out and show growth. The next three, one being on the bottom right, are those that are trying to pivot. They're financially strong, but something's gone wrong with strategy. And essentially, that isn't the way forward anymore. They're leveraging their financial strength to reinvest and unlock the potential for growth, and in some cases, aggressive. The last two have come out stronger, strategically and financially. One is consolidating and growing, so you hear about a lot of acquisitions or inorganic growth, and the other ones are disrupting, challenging the way we have traditionally operated. They're challenging our business models, especially those that are in survival or are restructuring. These organizations have created agile structures and are focusing on sustainable growth. So when we work with our clients, the boards, the executive teams, the people leaders, we don't do another exercise which could potentially have long-term effects, but in the short run, they may not get the results. So the whole idea is to ensure we help organizations short-term, mid-term, long-term. And we help them drive some initiatives. So if I could give you a flavor in the next 2 or 3 minutes of what that is, if I go to the next slide, the first step really is the organization profile. And there's a lot of information. And the way I've created this deck is when you get it, you can read through it and understand it a bit better. This is an appetizer to help you understand what next, right? So the first one is accountability, which is the what. The second is the how, which is capability. And the third is the why and the who, and which is the identity. So for example, when you look at an organization, accountability would focus on articulating objectives, the path, and plan sustainable outcomes. Capability, which is the how, would focus on skills enhancement trajectories, structures that are nimble and that can be moved around fairly fast, an external network and influence. Identity of an organization would anchor on core beliefs. Now, you may not see a lot of change, but the way the beliefs are acted upon might change. There'd be a lot more adaptability, and they'd be all on the aspiration superhighway trying to make things happen. If we go to the next slide real quick, this would help articulate how we overlay the required people profiles from leaders to successors, to high posts, to high performers and broader employees. Full-time employees to contract gig, basically creating an organization that can challenge historical staffing to a more results-aligned structure. Nothing is in parallel now, everything is really intertwined. So the last two slides, if I go to the next slide, essentially just to give you a flavor, there's a number of different accelerations, but you will see that the term development or strategy has changed to acceleration. So the first one, I picked a few random. The first one was accelerating leadership. Basically, it helps us use external forces to the benefit. So when you start the journey from the what, you start using those external impacts to really put wind in your sail. And as you go through the how, the who, the why, you move towards a more sustainable performance. Now, this is just a snippet of what we can do as professionals within our organization from a leadership development standpoint. And the next slide is finally around culture. Something we talk about all the time, but the message of boards now is don't talk to me about long-term culture change, but how we can accelerate it. And it's essentially by identifying critical area groups within the organization and filling those gaps, driving mindset change, overlaying levers to drive that shift into a state of cruise control, if you may. And the whole idea is you're heading towards sustained evolution. At the end of the day, the P&L focus, the growth focus, the brand focus, consumer fulfillment, net promoter scores is not going to change. It's how we move towards that with a lot of acceleration. And then just towards the end, the last slide, I'm just going to stop there, just to give you an idea, just to take all the data off the slides and let you think about it. Feel free to email me if you have questions. We'll have questions later on in the session as well. Just one thing I do want to tell you, this is not a sprint. We've often used the word, it's a marathon. It's also not a marathon. It's now changed to an Ironman. Something that we are not used to. It will need every one of us to commit to change. Every one of us to make a mindset change. To ask ourselves, are we really contributing or do we need to accelerate our capability growth? All very important questions. My request to all is take the first step. Yes, it is daunting even for me, but you can help your organization. Let's strengthen our organization, our nation, and our communities together. So thank you again, and back to you.
Thank you very much, Prashant. Our next speaker is also online, Gaurava Sahi from McKinsey & Co. Can we have him on screen, please? I would like the audience to, take note of what kind of questions you want to ask. We're hearing a lot of interesting remarks, a lot of interesting theories. How would you actually put them into practice? So I look forward to an engaging Q&A at the end of this.
Hi everyone, good afternoon, and I hope I'm audible.
Perfect, Gaurav. Perfect.
All right, thanks, Prashant. So, firstly, thank you for inviting me over, and I really apologize for not being there in person, but the implications of the MCO have been a little more personal in terms of impact on me, and I'm stuck in India. And I was looking forward to getting back, but the announcement yesterday kind of put paid to my plans. So thank you and apologies to begin with. Now, I wanted to kind of build on Prashant's point and just give you our perspective on the HR implications of this, the pandemic. So I hope my slides are visible.
Yeah, it can be seen.
Can be seen. All right. So, the way we looked at the pandemic, right? We went through multiple phases, right? There was the initial adrenaline that kicked in when COVID actually started impacting. We kind of went into kind of shock and stress on the lockdown, and are now looking at kind of how do we pull back on the stress on the second wave. But the way we kind of articulated that planning ahead would actually be around, preparing for the great acceleration to come. But what we feel is that it is not going to take the form of more of 2019. 2021 is going to be very, very different in terms of how organizations and individuals operate and interact going forward. If I was to go ahead, what the pandemic has done is not just in isolation, right? There were certain shifts that were happening, but the pandemic has just kicked that into very, very high gear. For example, we've seen purpose become very, very important to employees. In our recent survey, 72% of employees said we want to work for a company that is solving for something. It can't be just money that's driving it. Digitalization has kind of taken up, the pandemic has really put emphasis on that. Automation seems to be around the corner. Alternative job models are also becoming de rigueur across the economies, right? It is not just for the developed economies anymore. So a lot of things are happening, and the pandemic is kind of accelerating a lot of these trends. Now, going forward, what was revealed by the pandemic was also that the industrial thinking, right? The whole area of how the organizations were created, of organizations, the machine, hierarchical, with predictable performance, frontline operations optimized, is not going to stand anymore, right? Because one, leaders have also, organizational leaders have seen that the things that they thought impossible have been made possible by the pandemic response from the employees. For example, nobody thought working from home could be done at scale. It was always thought to be something that a few people do, and it looked at negatively. Suddenly, there is a large proportion of our people working much faster, much more involved, but working from home. The downside is people, specifically the middle management, is kind of feeling, what do we actually do? How do we actually add value, and so on and so forth. So the pandemic also revealed a lot of systemic flaws in terms of how the organizations chose to shape themselves up. So we believe that it is now the time to reimagining the organization, right? And HR has a huge role to play in this journey. So moving from a traditional hierarchy, the pyramid, you have your top leadership, your middle managers, and the frontline, to a much more dynamic system of how the organizations are kind of organized. A key question to ask is, where does the magic actually happen? What are the cells where the magic happens when work is delivered? And those are the questions that are getting answered or need to be asked as well, right? So certain organizations have kind of taken a view that this is how we organize, and so on and so forth. Now, when we looked at this, right, we realized that there were three basic fundamentals on how organizations should consider this. Number one, identity. Who are we, right? Who we actually are. And that talks to the purpose, the values, and the culture of the organization. The second is agility, in terms of how do we operate. And that talks about the structure, the talent we have, and the decisions we make. For a very long time, financial capital was treated as much more important than human capital. It's now changing. People have realized that while finance makes things move, so the bigger criteria there is talent. So how do we treat people as the scarcest capital? And finally, scalability, in terms of how do we actually grow? How do we outlearn our competition? How do we find more value in data? How do we leverage an ecosystem to kind of create new drivers for value creation, right? So those are the three fundamentals that we realize. On the next page, there is some bit of detail around this, right? But the imperatives that are important has to be chosen based on the current situation that the organizations are in. And when we took a deeper dive in what these situations could be, we kind of came up with two distinct tables, right? One is kind of emerging faster and stronger from this, which is more around the radical productivity response. How do we make sure that we are more aligned to a much more productive organization? What do we need to do? Zero-based design, look at our decision-making processes, transform the talent, or look at a full reimagination. And this is more relevant in businesses where the business continuity is not in kind of question, where all the 9 blocks could be in play around shifting the identity, moving more agile, deploying much more tech-driven solutions, and so on and so forth. Right? So these are the two playbooks that we see that organizations could leverage, and there could be many other flavors based on the current situation where there is more a discussion on how this can be demonstrated. Now, I'll come to the crux of which is relevant to a lot of people sitting there. What is the role of HR in this? Right? So when we looked at this, fundamentally we saw HR has a role to play across all the three imperatives and across all the 9 things that need to be delivered. There are some where HR is facilitating, which is more around establishing and radiating a purpose, talking about culture, looking at structure, decision making, and so on and so forth, where HR facilitates businesses coming to the right decision and kind of executing them on ground, making a much more business involved lens. But there are certain which HR drives, which is more around how do I rebalance my talent resources, or how do I go about flexibilizing my workforce and reducing employee costs. How do I ensure that the right performance management system is in place? How do I plan using a strategic workforce view and talent magnetism, right? And then you of course have the HR staples of learning, a service platform for employees, creating an ecosystem for HR players to kind of come up to speed. Right? So we believe that HR has a huge role to play going forward in making sure all of these 9 imperatives kind of come together for the organization. Now, interestingly, when we spoke to about 150 odd HR leaders, CHROs across the globe, what we found was that most of them in the near future wanted to focus on the identity and agility pillars, which basically meant we need to make sure that our businesses are responding with agility. That speaks to the point of where does magic actually happen. We need to drive leadership culture and employee experience because those have been proven to have a direct linkage to productivity. We need to ensure we have the right people in the right place. We need to button down and double down on what is the purpose that we serve for both employees and the broader society, right? To be able to give back. And finally, we need to simplify the organization. It's become too complex, too many layers, too many decision points. So how do we simplify organizations coming to value? If you go through, CHROs are kind of prioritizing these elements. Obviously, depending on what your organization is facing, you could look at other imperatives as well. But this is the general view that has come up. Now, before I end, right, I just want to share, and this is something that a lot of talk has happening about it, right? For years, HR professionals wanted a seat at the table. Now they have a seat in a major way, right? So what we like to say is the last financial crisis was a CFO-driven crisis, right? Because it was basically around financial elements. This one is a people crisis. So this is where CHROs need to step in and earn their money. This is where they are going to be imperative in the solution. And in terms of setting up for success, right, we feel that there are 3 steps. Number one, HR needs to define with respect to the business strategy where do they need to be excellent and where it suffices to pass the bar. You don't need to be the world's best in everything. Figure out where do you need to be the best and go after that. Always start from the business strategy. And from there, derive people, culture, and organizational implications. Right? So nothing should be done which is like not linked or links back directly to the strategy. There are responses that were given with respect to the pandemic, but the new acceleration would require us to kind of base ourselves in the strategy. And finally, the core themes of change need to be defined, right? And it is an evolving situation. So obviously, the interventions need to be course corrected as we go along. So those were our kind of 3 steps on how HR can set themselves up for success. I will hand it back now to Rashmi and obviously take questions when we open up a question.
Thank you so much, Gaurav. Our next speaker is Mr. Anthony Raja, and I'd like to invite him here to make his opening remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashmi. Right, so I'm not doing a presentation, so I'm going to be talking straight from my heart and straight from some experience, but 2 particular areas I'm going to be focusing on. One is the different generations of workforce and how do they behave pre, during, and post. And if there is something called post-COVID, not yet, I think. The second part is how is the evolution of the future of work before MCO and after that, what's happening around it, right? And is it still the same? Is it going to be the same pace? Is agility activation and acceleration about the same. So first part, let me start with what happened. March 18th announcement happens. So I have 13 countries. The first thing that came up to our mind was safety, health, protection, right? So to get everybody online, BCP was triggered and we started connecting to everyone. We assigned a BCP lead in every location and an everyday update thereafter. And every update was unique, by the way, from every country. So everyone was grappling for information. Everyone was getting their kind of ideas organized, but nobody did have a ready framework. Was there one? Was there a ready framework for pandemic of this nature, right? Of course, different organizations were ready at different stages. But my personal experience did tell us that there's a lot to learn when it started. So putting together all the safety is one, but also making sure that if you are employing 1.5 million people in APAC, how do you manage that? So you're also responsible for all of them as well, right? The organizations, all the clients calling you and asking you what's happening, how are you going to ensure SOPs are in place, how do you ensure you have your temperature checks, your sanitization, everything is in place, right? So all of these were going on, but what was inspiring to note was from a business readiness perspective, from a continuity perspective, the clients came together as well, and the teams came together. So let's put together the different generations. So we had the latent from 25 to 65, all categories of workers within the group. And I think you might know, as a group, we employ a lot of people across the region, across the industries. And the biggest hit, of course, as all of you know, was the hotel industry, hospitality, and the aviation was the first. And we knew it was not easy. And one particular hotel, the first call to me was, we need to displace 20,000 people. And we have 30 days time. So it's not an easy situation to do, right? So I'm just sharing with you what was going on. And in that learning, what we learned from a readiness perspective was to make sure that we have a planned approach, a face-by-face approach to execute something. We could not do it clinically. We realized that that's something, although the pandemic has to be addressed clinically, but we were not ready to address the people impact from HR side clinically as well. So let me come back to Malaysia for a minute. So we have about 13 million working population, of which 50% are Y generation. Am I right? So young workforce, huh? Right. So how many of us are Y generation in the group here? Anybody wants to lift their hand? Oh yes, one shy hand went up just now. And millennials, of course, we have got the Z generation starting work this year as well. So how do they see embrace work now? Let me just touch a little bit on that. How do they see work? And especially after MCO. So work from office, work from home, and now work from anywhere, right? So I think that's the trend that's happening. But the question is, for the Z generation and the Y, work from anywhere is normal. But for the others, they had to make the shift. So for example, let me just come back to our own organization, my personal experience. So we have about 300 people here in Malaysia. And adjusting to work from home wasn't easy. And the lessons we learned was extraordinary. How certain groups of people could, or families, adjust with the families, and some who could not, right? And from that, we put together a plan. Should there be another pandemic, what can we do? Should there be a phase 2, phase 3, what do we do? So we started putting a book of knowledge, if I may say, right? And competency along with it into managing that. How do we shift? But I must tell you one thing, the entire organization went live the next day from home. So we were prepared from a technology perspective, but we were not prepared from a life perspective. From a technology, we had all the readiness, but from a life perspective, we were not ready. So there is a huge amount of emotional and social issues that arose from that. Is a second thing we learned. First, from readiness, of course, safety, SOP, policy, everything. Then different age groups coming together. Then about the life readiness. So tech readiness was there, but the life readiness was not there. So we learned and we put that together as well. So what we also did was we made sure there was a program instituted post MCO for every new employee in terms of both SOP readiness, it's also life readiness. We introduced a emotional and social program so that they know how to adjust at home and adjust with clients, adjust with partners, etc. Right. So that was my first part. And along with it, we made sure every employee got what's a credentialing program. So we introduced a BCP program and an emotional and social intelligence program. We just added the latest one for mental hygiene. So I'm just sharing with you from a business perspective and a readiness perspective, what were the initiatives we added. So I'm done with the first part. Let's move to the next part, future of work. So automation, digitization, transition. From an automation perspective, I must say that there's a lot of paperwork was still there. In fact, running a payroll for 20,000 people a month is also another thing. And also how to make sure that we have the shift taking place without errors. From a digitization perspective, from tech readiness, we were there, but that's not enough. Just having all the mobile phones and systems and all is not enough. I think digitization is also about embracing that and able to work from an environment where you can. You know what? The first thing we learned was you must be instantaneously available. Did you feel that? And even now, then when we call or when we connect, why aren't you connected to Microsoft Teams? Why aren't you ready? There's no acceptance of if you are doing anything else. Were you taking care of your children or you going into the room or anything like that? The expectation was, were you there? So we had to do a kind of reverse mentoring as well. That's the learning. And I'm talking from a future of work perspective because we had to reverse mentor and say expectation-wise, please learn as leaders of the organization as well. So it's not about the team, the management, the line and everyone, but it's also about leadership. So career skills, business skills and digital skills. We compressed all of them. I have not done so many microcredit programs in my entire life. What I've done in the last 3 months. So we had to add opportunity to add all of that. And of course, I mean, not all organizations can do, but I must say MDEC was very helpful in many ways because they introduced a lot of such programs as well to complement what we are doing. All right, so I should end off now. I must tell you, in the last few days, I've been learning something interesting. Have you heard of, how many marathon runners are here? I might connect with one of the panelists who was telling about marathons. I think Prashant. Any marathon runners? Have you heard of a hyper marathon? Right, okay. I learned something this week about hyper marathons. It's not just about the 42 that you have to run. It's beyond that, right? So that trend is now picking up post-MCO worldwide, post-COVID. So people are going into that individual learning experience beyond that common ability that they have or satisfactory limits for personal development. They are also looking at an organizational perspective to innovate and go beyond that. And of course, from a sports and gaming perspective as well, they are also stretching that bit. So these are some of the shifts that we have noticed, and hope what I've shared is going to be helpful to you for your practical application. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Next, I'd like to call Dr. Jim to come up and share his opening remarks.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll try to keep my part within the time frame. I understand that it's quite a quiet crowd normally after lunch, right? And again, I've no slides to show. Just want to share things that from my own personal experience as well as from the work that I do with clients. So a little bit about Willis Towers Watson. We are both in insurance broking and advisory company. I'm the country head for the HR advisory business for Willis Towers Watson. and we deal with a multitude of clients from large to medium-sized organizations. But I think one of the main things that we've experienced through this COVID pandemic that we all face is that big shift in terms of how organizations and people look at the difference between just mainly managing shareholders' expectation towards what I call stakeholder expectations, right? So this shift, as I see it, gives me the immediate connection that there's actually a softer side to everyone, that it's not all about just business, and money, but it is also the importance of putting in place the relevant aspects of well-being and connectedness to our people. So we've seen a lot of those things that has happened over the last couple of months. But one of the things that which I will be covering as part of my this couple of minutes talk is beyond setting in place those enablers, is really about that productivity and performance element to it as well, which is something that we see a lot of organizations struggling with, right? So recently I had experience of going somewhere like all other Malaysians, visiting some of the resorts that we have in Malaysia. We are actually very blessed with so many of these different islands and different resorts in the country where we can find somewhere to go even during this recovery period, as opposed to our neighboring country, Singapore, we can only just go around the island, right? But one thing I picked up during that little excursion that I have was the change in how businesses have starting to embrace the concept of building confidence. So one of the things that I noticed from that little excursion was that, for example, if I walk into the hotel where they serve food, they have started to place barriers. They've started to handle the food for you, and they have started to just limit you having to deal with having to touch any of the apparatus on the table. And everything is sort of put in place for you to minimize the level of contact between people. And of course, the wearing of face masks. These little SOPs that we as people who visit these sort of locations tend to pick up to know that they actually have the care of their customers and the well-being of their employees in place. Those things gives me immediately the perception and the feeling of confidence as a customer to know that if anything at all, this is the kind of place or this is the kind of outlet that I would like to come to. So one key takeaway that I saw from this process was that there was also going to be a higher increase in the cost of administration, simply because there's more wastage, there's more people that need to put on the ground, on the floor to basically get everything done. But to what effect that this should bring us? A more sustainable business, a better confidence with our customers, ability to see ourselves through these difficulties? I like to think so. So that part about employee or being together, the customer confidence was something that I saw significantly as how organizations are moving away just purely on shareholders' expectations towards stakeholder expectations, managing people, managing customers, managing employees, and the likes. The other thing that I picked up as well through my experience working with companies is also largely on the principle of performance and productivity. One of the things that we noticed, and we did some of these surveys across the region in Malaysia as well as globally, we found that there were a few interesting insights. The first one was that there was only a very marginal increase in organizations seeking to do things differently. And I don't mind sharing, there was roughly about 8%, bringing it from 35% to 43%, which is still fairly low, right? So that begs the question, if we are thinking about what my earlier panelists were sharing about redefining our core, rethinking about how we operate our business, that is a very low sentiment in my opinion. So that will have an impact on performance and productivity. The second thing that I picked up as well was that a lot of businesses during this period was focusing on looking at the enablers of the organization, putting in place employee well-being aspects, putting in place SOPs, putting in place all the necessary things that would enable them to come back to work. But those element of shifts that they have made were only resulting in them being able to connect to the organization, but very little in terms of how they can contribute to the organization, which has an impact to performance and productivity. So why I talk about that element of contributing, it has a relevance of how we traditionally start to do work. Do we still need to come back to the office and do what we used to do? So there is this concept that I'd like to share with you called job portability. A lot of organization adapts new way of working in terms of SOPs and all that, but they never re-look at how the jobs and the activities in those jobs are being constructed. Are they enabling them to continue to contribute at the level that they could? Or are they just remaining as status quo? So job portability, or sometimes what we call deconstructing and reconstructing those jobs, become an important element that most organizations we see have not addressed in the process of post-COVID challenges, right? And the third thing that I saw as well, which also statistically they were showing some evidence of what the impact of the response of the survey, was that a lot of leaders, senior leaders who responded in terms of behaviors, and they put in place, again, those enablers that, again, my other colleagues have shared as well. But one thing that they were not open to was non-traditional employment, which relates to the concept of the gig economy, which my colleague here, Shireen, who is also a champion in terms of those areas of future work, right? So what does this tell us? That is actually in relation to what I shared earlier, that without job portability, there is actually no opportunities for us to broaden the repertoire of employment, because we do not know how we can measure performance, how we can actually put the work that we do internally to the external world and also at the same time deliver on performance and value, and at the same time safeguard the interests of the organization. So these two concepts around portability as well as broadening the repertoire of employment becomes critical in driving performance and productivity. And last but not least, one thing that we picked up in this process was the reset in culture. Because traditionally, we are very used to what? Face-to-face. We are very used to having a conversation with our colleagues in the corridor, in the pantry, in the meeting room. That connection is somehow a nature to humans, right? But today, we work from anywhere. We work from home. We work from all sorts of places. We even work from the beach. But the interesting thing here is that there's this concept called out of sight, out of mind, right? When you're out of sight, you're out of mind, you do not know where are you in terms of that positioning, where are you in terms of your valuing, where are you in terms of your contribution. So re-looking at the concept of addressing this out of sight, out of mind with regards to performance and the culture that we bring in to the organization is critical for a lot of the senior leaders to think of in these 3 to 4 lenses, right? Which I shared earlier. So if there's anything at all that you will take away from my part here, is to really look at stakeholder primacy as one thing. And the second thing here as well is to look at how you can bring about contribution to the organization, removing the managing layer and into the contributing layer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. I'd like to invite John Lim next to make his opening remarks.
Thank you, Rashmi. I'll share a bit about my organization, and then I'll share my agenda and what kind of perspective I'm coming from. So I come from the Center for Asia Leadership, which is an organization that was born at Harvard University among scholars and alumni at the Harvard Kennedy School. and fellows at the Harvard Asia Center. And we actually focus on research, training, as well as study tours. And we, in 2015, we were fortunate to have founded a regional office here in Malaysia, where we've been operating since that year. So I'll be giving a perspective mostly from a research and training and publications perspective as well, and also from my experiences also, because most of our clients here in Malaysia are multinationals, local and also international, in finance and food and property. So I'm gonna share from that perspective. So number one, I'm going to share actually from my own story. I hope that I don't share too many personal things that make me lose my credibility, but I'll try to. I know that the most personal is the creative. I'm going to draw some lessons from what we did as an organization, and also of course our conversations with our clients and surveys we did across the region. Then I'll share some of those findings. And then third, I'll share some leadership takeaways that I hope can be of some value to you. So if we look from an individual kind of perspective, right? This is called the Kubler-Ross change curve. When you are going through some type of shock or some type of crisis, right? The common responses are shock, denial, frustration, depression. In the month of March, April, and May, I wonder if a lot of you have faced some of these things. I know I have, and I'll show you some photos as well. I won't share anything too revealing, but there's a lot of lonely walks from home to the grocery store and back, and then basically at home doing work. So this is roughly kind of like from the personal to the business on the right. All of our programs, our clients, we can't do anything. Everything is canceled. I'm not from Malaysia originally, so I'm from Canada and the Philippines. So I'm looking. My family is in the Philippines and Canada as well as Japan. Just seeing their safety, because things got bad like in other countries before they got bad here. And then of course the dreaded Zoom calls. So if you look at the box here, we started here, the shock, denial, frustration, depression. But then, we tried to make the most of the situation. And we go to experimentation, and we try to also, be a bit more decisive in how we're going to move forward, right? So, I've tried to, oh yeah, you guys see it. I try, on a personal side, like especially when things opened up, I became a cook. I took up kickboxing. Okay, don't take that up if you don't like getting punched in the face. Also, I started on my second master's at the Harvard Kennedy School. From an organizational perspective, we really, so there's this, if you look in the photo in the middle, that's supposed to represent the learning. We really need to be on the same frequency of our most important stakeholder, which in our organization, that's the talent and HR development officer, or vice president, or director, right? We had to adapt, and we did so in many ways. And then right now, again, it's personal from the left, and then more company organizational to the right. Now we're in the third stage of decision, and then trying to integrate these lessons and trying to create a new normal, right? So I mean, we're going through our own crucibles. I had a bit of trouble, just because things seem to be slowing down, in terms of getting visas. I usually spend about 40% of my time overseas. So, I mean, these are more personal things. But from an organizational perspective, we're trying to also find how do we be disruptive? What's that sweet spot that we can move and be agile? You know, you might see these photos on the bottom. That is actually our virtual conference center, and that is also our virtual office. Okay, so this is VR. So we've been experimenting with that. How do we make the most of that in terms of the training and learning space? So this is the third stage that we're in here. It's mainly the recovery phase, which can be we understand already that it's going to be prolonged. We have to accept that we have to make a lot of changes, and I'm going to share also from our research. We did several research studies and also had several focus group discussions with MNCs across the region about some of the challenges that they're being faced with. Now, I shared this Kubler-Ross change curve. This is more from an individual perspective. Morale competence is on the y-axis. Time is on the x-axis. Over here, it's changed. Disequilibrium and stress is on the y-axis. Time is constant on the x-axis. Now, one of the things here is that as an organization, when a crisis happens, the disequilibrium and stress goes way, way up, that it's almost like too much to handle. And you're just trying to stabilize the situation. Now, right now, we're in what is called, you can call it the adaptive phase, you can call it the recovery phase. But one of the things here that's very, very important is that you can't just go back to the way things were. You have to really make the most of the situation. You want to be in the learning zone. You want to continually adapt to what the reality is. And for us, this is a glimpse of our internal dashboard. We did a survey of over 200 mid-level, senior-level managers across the region. We found, I won't go too in depth in this. If people want me to share the slides, I'm happy to do that. But we divided it into 3 categories in people, business, and tech. So on the people side, it's maintaining morale, learning and productivity in new roles, employee health and safety. On the business side, it's designing new business models for the changing, because your most important stakeholder is your customer, right? How are they actually changing? What's their psychology like? How do we deliver to them? And obviously, revenue recovery. On the tech side, their challenges were on leveraging technology and product and service, and obviously, of course, on remote work as well. And not only this, but of course, we have our own internal dashboard that we're always looking at and updating it based on our conversations, on our focus group discussions. And then this has to be a constant, right? You have to have some type of learning loop in your organization, which I'm going to talk about later. And obviously, we not only our own type of research, but we looked at BCG reports, McKinsey reports. McKinsey has a lot of excellent reports. And based on this, what we did was, this is our framework. It's very, very simple. Okay. It's very, very simple. It's called head, hands, and heart. It's the cognitive skills, understanding what the reality of the situation is through data, questioning systemic thinking, intervention skills, decision-making, experimenting, actually moving, and then also relational skills, introspection, creating a holding environment, and then also bridging. And Anthony mentioned how he was able to kind of create his playbook. I know there's different ways. Each organization, company has different frameworks which they have. Sometimes it's like the self, the teams, and then the organization. We use head, hands, and heart. But what we did, what you have to do is actually, from the data that you have, how do you adapt your current framework to what is most important? I think I just have about a minute left. Okay, so I won't go over this, but there's essentially 3 leadership takeaways that we have, and this reflects a lot of the same themes of what my colleague said, which is number 1, recognize the unique opportunity you have. It can't be normal. It can't be returned to normal. It has to be to renewal. Okay, so that's the lesson there. Number 2 is confront outdated assumptions, pivot, and then pivot based on what you see. And then third is, this is more from a people side. You have to invest in the spaces and the places for reflection, for introspection, because you have to create new meaning from this for your people. And essentially, these are the three leadership lessons that we were able to garner after reflection and after discussions with leaders across the region. Okay, so thanks very much.
Thank you very much, John. And last but not least, Dr. Sumitra, may I invite you to make your opening remarks? Thank you.
Thank you, Rashmi. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to also share my perspective. There's actually quite a lineup of us in this session. I'm not sure. It might be the biggest lineup. Is it the biggest one? Yeah. 7 speakers. So that's really quite a lot to swallow. But I guess, there's always pros and cons of being the last one, as in everybody has said everything. But also the other thing is, we sort of get to wait and see how we can address whatever's left, right? How do we top it all with icing at the top? So, as Rashmi mentioned, my name is Sumitra, and I work for the Malaysia Digital Economy Corporation, MDEC, and my role there is to look at how do we help to develop talent that meets the requirements of the digital economy. And so MDEC is not a new organization. I'm sure many of you are familiar or have heard of it. It's been around for more than 20 years, and we've evolved just like all other businesses. We've evolved as well, but we're not really a business. We're a semi-government agency. We're a company that's owned by MOF Inc. Yeah, so I like to describe us as a not-for-profit JLC. That's how I would describe us as. We undertake services on behalf of the government that benefit the people and companies in Malaysia, and so. Before COVID, right? I'm sure many of you would have been in talks where, MDEC has been talking about the importance of digital. In fact, that was kind of like our clarion call, even, for many, many years already, talking about the need to go digital, the need to embrace it in your business, in your work, in your career, so on and so forth. But I guess in some, and yes, it was happening. So prior to COVID, just to give you a sense, prior to COVID, the take-up of digital, at least digital technology, extensively in SMEs was less than 20%. Many SMEs in Malaysia, yes, they have computers, they have internet access. Even before COVID, many of them had internet access. They were using it for some amount of social media marketing, some amount of maybe HR, processing, minor operational roles, but not extensively. It was less than 20%. And so here we were, MDEC, trying to get people to go digital, trying really hard, feeling like it was 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. And then COVID struck, right? And when COVID struck, and I'm sure you've all seen the anecdotes out there, that COVID, in some ways, is the most effective CIO around, right? Because COVID accelerated digitalization in all ways, yeah? So even if you think about in Malaysia, for example, you would say, take the education sector, and we as parents would say, it's really difficult, education to get online, will never happen. There's no this, there's no that, there's no this. But lo and behold, even education has gone online. not perfect, but it has gone online. And so that's the situation we face today. When COVID struck, everybody suddenly had to go digital overnight, right? At MDEC, the day after, in fact, the day before, or rather the days leading up to the MCO, we had expected something like that to happen. And so we had been preparing ourselves. And so when we went into MCO, we continued to work remotely. There was no sort of a break. Yeah, immediately we were able to, because we had the technologies, we had been sort of thinking about it, and so we were able to pick up. And it was fortunate that we did, because with the urgency that people needed to go digital, we needed to get into action really, really quickly. Digital became front and center for everyone all at once. Yeah. So from a business point of view, I think over the first 2 to 3 months from MCO, surveys have shown that about 30% SMEs have gone on to now, not just SMEs, but 30% companies in Malaysia have started to look at upgrading their digital technologies, yeah, or their technologies within their business. And so this is a good sign. And we continue to see this urgency in wanting to go digital. And so a few things that we have done from MDEC, or working closely with the government point of view, is to look at how do we support SME digitalization. So through the Penjana, for example, you would have heard of the SME automation grant. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had a whole week of SME Digital Summit, really help looking at how we can guide SMEs to digitalize their business, because that was the only way forward, right? And as one of the speakers mentioned, we wanted to take this opportunity, and rather I think, as a nation, businesses and government realized that this was an opportunity for us to learn and to move forward. And so with that in mind, we went on this, we've been on this really aggressive mode to help businesses to digitalize. Other than the grant, we've also launched a website called dx.com.my, and this stands for Digital Accelerator. And so in one place, hopefully SMEs will be able to understand what it takes to digitalize and how do they go about it. Similarly, retailers have had to go online almost immediately. Yeah, so e-commerce has become, a backbone really for many of these businesses. So that's the other big focus for MDEC at the moment, to look at how do we onboard businesses onto e-commerce, and how do we drive demand, as well, consumer demand on e-commerce, which I must say there's been a huge spike since the start of MCO. So that's on the business side of things. But while we knew these changes are happening from the business end, we also quickly realized that it was impacting people. And this is not something new again, because even prior to COVID, there have been many conferences organized by various people talking about the future of work, so on and so forth, fourth IR, digitalization, how that's all going to change the workforce. But we always talked about it in the future of work, right? The future happened in March. And so that's, suddenly like you wake up one morning and you realize, oh my God, it's here, right? And so whatever it is that we thought was going to happen, suddenly we saw being accelerated. People were working remotely, suddenly the size of offices no longer mattered. I mean, we had startups or companies who had taken new leases, and then suddenly they realized that they didn't need so much space. We also found that companies started realizing that, as one of the speakers mentioned earlier, full-time employment, managing resources, there was a whole rethinking around that. People started to think about, how do I take advantage of what's happening right now to recalibrate my resources, right? Or my human capital. I may not need to invest in full-time employees or full-time contracts because, doing that meant I would be less agile. Having the ability to procure services or even talents on freelance basis, that sometimes helps me to be more nimble, as a company. So those are all things that we started to see. And what we also realized is SMEs, we did a couple of surveys ourselves, and we found that the SMEs felt their employees didn't have the digital skill sets needed, not only to work remotely, but to take their business digital. Yeah. So of course, working remotely is one. And I think those things are fairly low entry barriers that can be addressed, MS Teams, Zoom, whatever. But the other issue was digital skills to go digital. That's a little bit harder to address. And here I'm referring to things like digital marketing skills, skills to analyze data, because as businesses were going online, there was a lot of data that was being put out there. And so how do you analyze this data? Skills like security, cyber security, because again, as businesses were going online, subscribing to cloud services, and all those kinds of things, suddenly security became a huge issue. And then, you look in your little IT team and you don't have somebody with those kind of skills. And so those are all issues that started to surface. So over the last few months, we've been amping up things on the skill side, on the digital skills and talent side, in various ways. So of course, we've had we immediately started to have lots of online webinars, seminars. We started with something on e-commerce to train SMEs and their people. We then went on to talk about SME digitalization itself, what SMEs need to think about as they digitalize. Just last week, we had a whole week addressing the workforce. What kinds of new skills they need to acquire. What are the career prospects? Because we also know, of course, that with COVID, 850,000 people are unemployed. So what are the new skills they needed? So those are all things that were addressed last week. And this week, interestingly, someone spoke about gig. So this week, there is a gig and freelancer expo. And the whole idea is, again, to get people to understand what is gig work, where are the opportunities, how do you actually win these gig jobs? Because it's not like getting a full-time job. It's slightly different, right? So we've been amping up things on the skill side of things. Now, I know my time is up. And I think just in closing, I wanted to say that, there's always two sides of everything. And even with COVID, there's the plus and the minus. What worries me, right, on the minus is the risk of widening digital and opportunity gaps. Because while we said everything has gone digital, we also know that there are many children, only 30 to 40% of Malaysian children have even devices to learn at home, right? There are also many micro businesses that don't have the tools or the abilities to actually, the know-how to even go online. So there could be a widening digital and opportunity gap. And I think this is where it's really important for all parties to come together. As what the first speaker said, public and private sector, we really need to come together. And even within an organization, HR can't afford to work in silo anymore. You need to look at things holistically to be able to address this, collectively, because really this is the time that we need to cut across and come together to ensure that nobody is left behind. With that, thank you very much. Take questions later.
Thank you, Dr. Sumitra. Can we get Prashant and Gaurava on screen, please? We're going to open up. I'm going to address a few questions to our esteemed panelists as soon as we... And I think I'll stand here because I think this side of the room can't see me. I'm hidden behind this podium, so I'll just stand here. Can we have Prashant and Gaurava on screen, please? Can you hear us? Prashant?
Yes.
Gaurav? Yeah? Yes. All right, great, excellent. So I'm going to start with my first question. I'm going to address it to Prashant. You talked a lot about archetypes of business. What are you looking at? Examples of organizations. Would you like to share with us some example of an organization which has really pivoted during this time, during COVID, and how have they done it? Very quickly. What kind of steps would they have taken, or what changes would they have made to be able to pivot in this time?
Sure. If you look at most of the organizations that we've been working with Rashmi, is unfortunately, many of them have been in the restructure phase, and many of them have been in survival. The survival phase has been more of a focus on trying to retain the best and brightest, try and retain incumbents that have shown potential and have the skills for the new direction of the organization. It's also been in situations where, especially those that are trying to pivot, is working with them that you see them as large conglomerates, but actually breaking them down and divesting the businesses to form smaller, more bite-sized organizations that have their own controls to help make certain decisions and be nimble as smaller entities rather than pushing forward as one large conglomerate. We've seen that. We started some of the work with those organizations pre-COVID, but the acceleration actually happened more post-February. What I would say to most attendees and organizations listening, Gaurav talked about it as well, and McKinsey's done a ton of that. Some of that work will be focused on some of the people side of things. Is really to have a look in the mirror and not try and distinguish people in the business. They have to go hand in hand. It is not an option. Also, as human beings are the first thing that comes in. We don't want change to happen. We want to continue trying to do things the way we've done it. What I would urge you to do is that you have to change that mindset. If you're going to do the same old or hang on to best practices, other organizations are going to pass you by. So you have to challenge the norm. You have to think differently. You have to think about it from an association. I mean, Dr. Sumitra talked about it as well. For example, last week during the 1 week focused on digital, we were trying to see how we could help aid. How much where you find the best digital talent? How do you structure your organization from a digital perspective? How much do you pay your digital talent? So that's, we've been very fortunate that way that we've had folks like MDEC, Dr. Sumitra, who have been very encouraging to help many of these organizations that are in the different modes. Not that many that are pivoting, but many that are reorganizing, restructuring, the few that are on Google.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much, Prashant. So basically, you're saying we need to be ready to change and not continue doing what we've been doing in the past. I think my next question would go to Anthony. Anthony, you talked about multi-generational workforces. You talked about managing the emotional and social issues. Could you tell us a little bit about? We all have BCPs. We're all familiar with BCPs, but emotional and social. What were the kind of steps you put into place to manage that for your people?
So, I guess the first is creating an awareness that you have challenges when you are starting to work from home. How do you interact with people? How do you interact and how do you transfer that working relationship with your supervisor, with your colleagues, and with your family? Right? It's all happening at the same time. So understanding that awareness creation is important. So we did a program that can put a perspective and help the person understand, the staff understand what it is about. The social side is, of course, missing what you would normally have, right? On a day-to-day basis, you're out, you're meeting friends, you're meeting your network, you're meeting clients. Even the way to work now has changed, right? If you talk to a client, it's no more the same method. And traditionally, if you see, Malaysia is very face-to-face culture, right? You're making a huge shift in the last 120 days into that nature. So both of this combined was more of an awareness program for the individual. We also have a kind of a short assessment to check whether they were familiar how to manage themselves first, then manage family system, then manage the work system, and manage the social system. So the assessment helped them, and the awareness program, which we did, got them to understand what needs to be done and how they manage themselves first. Because the idea was to get help to manage themselves first. Then they connect with the colleagues, the teams. So the supervisors were prepared first. We brought all the supervisors to a good understanding of how this can be transmitted. More of a coaching and appreciating of how the emotional side and the social side need to go hand in hand with regard to this. So that helped them kind of overcome the tussle they would have gone through in their mind. So we anticipated the challenges that they had in their mind, right? And the issues that they would go through with themselves in the process of shifting into that new way of work, I would say.
And do you think all the different generations managed that well?
All right.
Who do you think had the biggest struggle?
Absolutely. We have the 25 to 65, right? Average group. So we noticed that the ones which were most impacted were the ones with family and children. So we were talking about the 30s to 35. We noticed, we did a survey and feedback. So when you do that, you get to hear what was easy, what was difficult, what was challenging. So the most challenging group was that. Of course, the interest of the Z generation was very different. They were like, it's fine, we can connect, we can party via Zoom, There's different trending, they were fine with it. And of course, kind of adopting to the new technologies and using Zoom or Microsoft Teams. We were on Microsoft Teams, by the way, so we cannot use Zoom. So we got to get used to the flexibility. And so the senior generation group was kind of taking a little bit more time. So what we did was, we did a repetitive Microsoft Teams session, preparation for them. So we did a learning session, understanding session, and so on. I know it might sound trivial, but for the group of people we are talking about, it's not that easy. How to use it on a mobile device, how to use it, and on a notebook as well. So when they learned, of course, now it's the other way around. They'll be telling you the tips. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Anthony. I think I'll address my next question to Gaurav, because Anthony spoke about, upskilling people and, just the kind of things they did during this COVID thing. You've talked a lot about agile HR and, HR being on the table, so to speak, on the decision-making table. So can you give us some examples of the kind of things agile HR needs to do to really make this happen, to really make this new normal accessible to everyone, to every organization?
Sure. So thanks, Sme, for the question, right? So let me first say that agile HR has become a term that's been used quite often and not really translated into what it means for the HR teams in a way, shape, or form that it was thought about in the beginning, right? So if I take agility in HR, and I look at agility in HR from the perspective of delivery of what business requires, so that could be one lens, right? And the agility that HR needs to show around the COVID or the response could be around multiple areas, right? One of the areas that we saw was HR really leaning into the business on the topic of what's the workforce do you actually require? And it was mentioned around what's the digital talent, how do you pay, how do you get them, how do you attract them, how do you actually structure that entire that's an area where HR went into the business. The second area was morale and safety and health. So it behooves organizations to take that seriously coming out of a crisis like this. It's a life and livelihood crisis. It's not one on the other. So making sure that the employee side of things is kind of taken care of. There were initiatives by a lot of my clients on that particular aspect, looking at the emotional and social well-being of employees, making sure they connected not just with their managers, but connected at the emotional level to the organization. But show up for work and get not show up for work, right? So how do you bridge that gap? That's the one area where agile, HR has shown kind of a lot of agile implementation. And the third, the longer term in nowadays is about 15 days. Things change every 15 days. So the longer term implications of the workforce and productivity elements, specifically in organizations that aren't doing so well, right? So how do we ensure that while we take care of the organization, we are not stressing out or leaving our employees in the lurch, right? These are a few areas where my clients specifically, and we partner them to kind of deliver impact. The agility piece in HR is to be able to reorient resources, right? Fast and deliver these outcomes, because it's not about structures and processes right now. It's about delivering outcomes that are required immediately, and that's where the agility in HR is coming forward, right? So the teams that are coming, cells that are there.
Understood. Understood. All right. Thank you, Gaurav. And I think your answer actually leads me to my question to Dr. Jim, where I would like to ask you, you talked about connection and went on to contribution and performance. So in a situation where employees are still working from home, or there may be, another spike and we again go back to working from home, how do you manage productivity? A, how do you manage productivity? And B, how do you ensure that your productive employees stay with you? Even though it's a seller's market at this point of time, more people looking for jobs, but the good people are always in demand. So how would you ensure that your people stay productive, and how do you ensure that the people who are really productive stay with you?
All right. Thank you for the question. I would profess I wouldn't have all the answers to the problems of the market, but I'll try to maybe break this down into a few categories. So in answering the first part of the question, when we look at performance and productivity, I think the immediate opportunity during the COVID was that organizations started to put in this concept of a cadence in the ability to engage employees more frequently throughout the process. So those were some of the things that we found working, especially in organizations or even large organizations who needed to give a certain level of avenue and time for their employees to basically get engaged, as well as to also not look over their shoulders, but actually to basically give them the enablers to get the job done, right? So one of the things is that things like clarity, and also having that flexibility of saying that I do not need you to do 100%, but I need you to do what's enough, right? So we saw that a lot of leaders taking that perspective or that principle found it working for them, especially in this sort of situations. But of course, in a longer term perspective, that if you want to keep something more sustaining, whereby you can work from anywhere or work from home, etc., is really to re-look at reinventing the jobs. Because if you look at the jobs today, there's going to be a list of different activities that comes from things that are administrative, right? And all the way down to things that could require that can be automated as well, right? And also things that you may need both human and computer interactions that will give you higher value. So the principle here is that organizations need to take that step of saying that as we move towards that new era, how do we reconstruct those jobs? How do we reinvent those jobs? So those are some of the things that, we as a firm as well, we've been advising and been promoting this for the last 5 to 6 years, right? And we even have written authored a book around this area called Reinventing Jobs. So the principle of adapting into those elements of building more sustainable job descriptions and things that will rely both on human as well as automation will be the way forward.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Jim. Sumitra, my next question would be for you. We've talked about mental hygiene. We've talked about using, automation and human interaction together. You spoke about the challenges that SMEs are facing today with digitization. If you were to pick a couple of digital skills or a couple of future of work skills, what would you say would be the most critical for an SME? And maybe does the answer differ for medium scale or large scale enterprises? Would there be something different?
Thank you, Rashmi. I think off the top of my head, the common skills that we see are going to be in demand regardless are data, definitely,
Right.
in some form or other, whether it's data analytics or data engineering, just generally to have data-driven workers, right? That's a big one. And then, of course, the second one that is really important, as I mentioned earlier, is cybersecurity. That's increasing in importance as companies become more exposed to online platforms, right? For SMEs, especially those in the retail sector, in Malaysia, as you know, we've always traditionally been a country of trade, right? Trading post. I would say digital marketing is perhaps the third most important skill. And especially for SMEs in the retail and services sector.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Sumitra. That was a very clear answer. I think I'll go to Professor Niaz next. We've been talking a lot about organizations, companies, white-collar workers, but you also brought up women in agriculture and, maybe the unorganized sector. So how has COVID, how does post-COVID recovery look like for people who are maybe blue-collar workers or working in plantations, farms, and women specifically? You did mention women in agriculture. So could you give us some insight into what needs to be done for this group of people to help them with the recovery?
Thank you, Rashmi. So you are referring to what globally is known as the vulnerable population.
That's right.
The reason why women are part of the vulnerable population in the labor market is because of the kind of contract they hold, often part-time or often in terms of non-permanent work, what the International Labour Organization calls precarious employment. So therefore, in times of crisis, as firms adjust costs and trying to adjust labor costs, the women's are laid off more compared to men. So globally speaking, in all kinds of natural disasters, regardless of whether it's in the labor market or in agriculture, women remain vulnerable to loss of jobs. But this is only 50% of the story. The other part that this pandemic has exposed is the endowment deficit between men and women. So as my colleague was pointing out, the government investment in digitization effort, the evidence shows that in Malaysia, there is no gender divide in access to technology. When it comes to capability to use technology, there's big gender divide, right? So again, it's a combination of the contract, the type of work that the women do, and the capability that they have to benefit from those. That the two deficits combine together by leaving women as most vulnerable during times of crisis. There is a third element to it, that women, particularly those who are out of wedlock, don't have a second family member to compensate for the loss of income. And sometimes they're also in marriage where the husband has lost a job, and then they are being forced to enter the labor market, right? So that again adds in the sense that it adds to their double burden of work. They're still being the primary caregiver at home, and they're also being given the responsibility to seek job outside. So these are challenges for women regardless of manufacturing or agriculture. But in agriculture, this crisis can also bring up an opportunity in the sense that for quite some time in many parts of Malaysia, as men have been migrating to cities, agriculture has been left to women.
Okay.
And what this crisis has brought up is the importance of food security. Not just ensuring supply of food, but the quality of food, how the food is being processed, and how it is, how we are farming. And globally now, there is this realization that if we can leverage the presence of women in agriculture, this can go a long way in ensuring national food security. So this is therefore a time, I guess, for us to reflect on the power of women's agency in agriculture and elsewhere, and how Malaysia can leverage better the female workforce, because as we speak, only 55% of Malaysian women of working age are working. Contrast this to close to 80% of Malaysian men. Okay. And if we are looking forward to post-COVID Malaysia, where there is now this realization that Malaysia has to become self-dependent on its own labor force, the main contributory demographic group has to be women. So therefore, it is time for us to invest in women, empower them, also to rethink the kind of social and cultural forces that have been holding back their participation in the labor market.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Sorry, we have only a few minutes left. I'll ask one last question to John. John, you come from the Leadership Institute, and tell us something that leaders need to do. Give us two things that leaders need to really bring into play to ensure that post-COVID recovery, they're prepared for post-COVID recovery, or they're prepared to take their organizations forward in this time, if the crisis occurs again.
Okay, I think let me just actually point one thing. during the recovery period, I think what a leader should do is point out all the elephants in the room. Because, I mean, maybe during normal times where things are going smoothly, going well, it's not easy to bring those things which are uncomfortable. But right now, I mean, and there is still time to go through that renewal stage. And I mean, we will be in this COVID reality at least until perhaps even the end of next year, right?
Yeah.
There's still time. There's still time to revamp everything, renew mindsets, renew culture, renew the processes, operations. But it's during normal times, it's so hard to bring those things up, to disrupt those things.
Right.
But right now, that's what you got to do.
It's an opportunity sitting up. Oh,
Just to add one point on leadership, there is this recent piece of evidence that shows that globally, countries led by women as head of states have done far better in saving lives.
That's true.
That's true.
So this is again another reason why we want to sort of leverage female leadership as well,
Bring
not
all
just
women.
in managing the crisis, but also sort of the recovery
taking
process.
us
Thank
through
you.
it. All
I
right,
think
thank you very much.
That's a very interesting question because also, why is it that they are more successful in doing this than men? That's a very interesting
It's
research
the
question
human
to explore.
element is what I would believe. All right, I'm going to open the floor for questions. Would anybody like to ask our panelists? There's a whole lot of very, very sharp brains sitting there, so please feel free. Could you introduce yourself as well? And
Yeah, hi, my name is Alex Raja. So I've got 3 questions here. This first one is that I think
sorry,
this is-
Alex.
Yeah.
Okay. In the interest of time, there are more people asking questions. I will restrict you to one question.
Okay.
So pick one which
Okay,
is
cool.
really important.
Okay, then I'll just ask the first one first. For micro and smaller SMEs in Malaysia, we only have a 5,000 ringgit SME digitization matching grant. And sometimes we need e-commerce as well as ERP, CRM, HCM. So how do I get a mix of everything, given that I can only pick one and there's only one matching grant?
That's a really, really interesting question. And yes, you know, the requirements are many, but I think the idea is also not to overwhelm. So sometimes you sort of want to look at what needs to get done and prioritize and be able to open the doors, and then you go from there. Now, with regards to e-commerce, there is also a Go e-commerce platform, which helps you to upskill your people. There are different e-commerce incentives in place. So there are actually different incentives addressing different areas. You kind of got to look at which are the ones that you need and then piece it together rather than to expect a one size fits all, because different SMEs need different things.
How easy is it to find those?
Oh, just go to MDEC's website. Yeah. And should be able to find the links.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Sumitra. Does anyone else have a question, or I can open it back to Alex for his next 2 questions? Yeah, go there. Sir, could you introduce yourself, please? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Paul. I'm from Perkeso. Although only 10 months in Perkeso, so maybe in reference to John's last statement, point out the elephant in the room. I spent my whole life in private sector, mostly a vendor, and you can't fire a guy even if he's double the size of an elephant. How do you point him or her out? Any tips?
I'll do the best. Sometimes, obviously, like in an organization, when the system is entrenched, you have to create kind of pockets of innovation within the organization. I mean, maybe structurally, Prashant mentioned that there are ways to kind of structure kind of different mini organizations within a larger organization. So, you know, that's kind of a more technical solution to kind of separate individuals from kind of the larger decision-making structure. So they're part of, you know, they're kind of separate from the larger entrenched system. That's one. But, you know, I mean, I don't know if I can give like a silver bullet for that. It's really about how are you to kind of create pockets of the.
Dr. Jim, you want to add something, Dr.
No,
Jim?
I just wanted to say willpower.
Okay. I know we're out of time. I can take one last question if somebody would like to. All right. In which case, I don't have much time to wind up. I think we've had a very interesting set of conversations about post-COVID. Thank you, Prashant and Gaurava, for joining us online. Thank you, all of you. I'm not going to take up more time and run into the next panel's time. But we've heard this topic from a lot of different perspectives, from the wider policy angle that Professor Niaz and Dr. Sumitra came up with. We've talked about how organizations have done this at an organization level. We've heard from John about how he went through it personally and from a leadership perspective. Thank you, Dr. Jim, for your perspective on this. So thank you, everybody, and I hope you've all taken back something useful and practical from this. Thank you.